I should first of all say that my most recent appointment rather surprised me when I found out about it in the Daily Mail last Wednesday, having been asked by the Minister for Rail, Andrew Adonis, if I'd collaborate in a study of the state of the nation's railway stations. I read that I'd been appointed to conduct a personal survey of railway station toilets. So I'm still trying to get to grips with this new position, and that might have affected the quality of this lecture. However, I want to say something else more seriously, that I can claim no particular research expertise on this present subject. And in fact, much of what you will hear and see in the next at least half hour or so will be drawn from two rather critical sources, which I think will be familiar to many of you in the room looking round, and some of you undoubtedly had an active hand in one or two bits of these two. One is the State of the English Cities report by a huge group of academics led by Professor Michael Parkinson of Liverpool John Moores University, which appeared in 2006. Much more recently, the Centre for Cities, which has been making waves and has collaborated with academics up here, has produced its latest Cities Outlook, which is definitely the most fact-packed book on the state of English cities and towns at the present time. And since I'm supposed to talk to you about the impact of the recession, which is very difficult, of course, because data always chase behind reality, I'm going to depend rather excessively for the next 10 minutes or so on a set of tables and charts from that report with due acknowledgement to the authors. So let's look at some of the Centre for Cities tables. What they immediately begin to show is a pattern which is only too drearily familiar. That the places that are doing best in terms of employment are southern English places, with the interesting exception of Aberdeen, Oil City, and the places that are doing worst are disproportionately northern places, but with some surprises perhaps. Oxford, what's happening to Oxford academia, undoubtedly some strange statistical glitch. And among the major cities, you'll find Bristol and Edinburgh at the top of the table, and generally the northern and Midland cities lower down, but by no means, except for Birmingham, at the or Liverpool at the lower end. And it's particularly sad that despite all the publicity Liverpool has had in recent years for its renaissance, there isn't as yet evidence of it in these tables. If we go on to look at employment growth, once again I fear it's the familiar old story, but with some rather interesting exceptions. The places that have grown fastest in the last couple of years have been a mixture of Midland cities like Derby, obvious suspects like Milton Keynes, and some surprising places like Blackburn and perhaps less surprising Preston, because in fact, these are part of what I'll argue later is a somewhat specially deprived belt up here in northwest England. The bottom 10 cities are equally surprising because they include places you'd imagine would be relatively resilient, such as Norwich, and again Birmingham and Chatham in the Thames Gateway corridor, and Leeds, which is always regarded as one of the really successful English core cities, as well as Warrington, which I personally find a very interesting case because it appears somewhat anomalously in many of these tables, having done rather well within the Northwest on the longer term, but with some contraction of employment, which again may be a statistical artifact, Warrington having depended very much on public service employment, and you would know that, Chancellor, as Deputy Chair of the NWDA, and it's perhaps a contraction in this area that may have contributed to that. phenomenon. Now, population growth, as all geographers know, is a less accurate guide because many English towns and cities are extremely spatially constrained. They have been emptying out over many years, but with the so-called urban renaissance, and I use that term advisedly, having been a member of the Urban Task Force, which had a report of that title. The so-called Renaissance, which has produced new building, very evident in Manchester, Salford, and new people in some of those buildings, not all of them, latterly. Nevertheless, this trend is actually working against a long-term decentralization. Nevertheless, it's the obvious suspects that come at the top: Milton Keynes, Oxford, and Cambridge, as well as a number of other southern places, with, as usual, the northern places at the bottom, although just to illustrate the perversity of some of these indices, Aberdeen almost at the bottom of the growth table. So let's look at some more direct indices of economic performance. In terms of earnings, it's very clear that it's generally the southern places that have the highest earnings, including places like Reading and Swindon in the M4 corridor, and your Vice-Chancellor was very active in a study of Swindon in its early growth days. It's remained extremely prosperous, partly due to decentralized public service employment. But interestingly, Warrington comes up way in the top 10. In sharp contrast to a place like Burnley or a place like Blackpool in the central Lancashire corridor. I won't comment in great detail on this chart because time is pressing, but would just point out that once again, unfortunately, among the large cities, it is places like Liverpool, Sheffield and Newcastle below the core of the core cities, embracing places like Leeds and Manchester, that have slipped behind the rest, which may suggest some kind of hierarchy appearing here. In terms of earnings growth, the growth figures are, as always, somewhat more complex, with, for instance, Blackburn anomalously appearing at the top of the table, but the blue indicates a sort of statistical problem there. Once again, it shows that a place that's way down the order may show a sudden and unexpected rise, perhaps from a very low base. When one looks at statistics like this, I'm always prompted to recall to my students George Bernard Shaw's famous story about how his earnings had increased spectacularly by 500% in 1 year, his books having sold for 1 shilling 5p in 1 year and for 2 shillings 10p in the next. One has to be always cautious about observing increases from low bases. But generally, the places down in the lower half, with again the surprising exception of Oxford and Cambridge and Crawley, include some of the northern places that you'd expect to appear in this list. But it's perhaps interesting here that there is an overrepresentation of southern places in the magic golden circle around London compared with some of the other indices, indicating that those places may be feeling a certain draft. I think a better indication from the Centre for Cities series is the benefit claimants, which do indicate a longer term employment problem. And here you get a very sharp north-south divide, and I needn't even labour the point anymore because it's very clear that it's the familiar list up at the top and unhappily the familiar list down at the bottom, with Liverpool at the very base bringing up the rest. In terms of the changes in claimant rates, that is, in changes in benefits, the story is as usual more mixed. Again, there's a predominance of northern places with the biggest increase in claimants, but perhaps surprisingly, Swindon appears here as well as Gloucester, as well as Warrington. And again, the lowest increases are in general southern places, but with a bigger geographical spread, extending also to places like Aberdeen. So the geography of prosperity or lack of prosperity is slightly unevenly spread across the country. Now, if we seek to probe a little deeper into these phenomena, we have heard a great deal in the last couple of years in the academic journals, and also from a think tank like the Work Foundation, which also, together with the Centre for Cities, has produced an enormous amount, I think, of very valuable analysis of what is really happening in our economy today. And we find, rather unsurprisingly, that the 10 most knowledge-intensive places are exclusively in the south, and most of them within around an hour's journey of London. With the London, with Oxford and Cambridge, followed by Reading. If we look at the 10 least knowledge intensive, I have to say that Blackpool comes in at 47, and the least knowledge intensive place appears to be Wakefield, despite its public service employment. And disproportionately, those places are what I'll call the smaller or medium-sized one-industry towns of northern England, places that depended historically on one or two manufacturing industries which have declined and have failed to make the transition to the new economy. Now, switching to the Centre for Cities analysis, from the Centre for Cities analysis to the State of the English Cities analysis, this, admittedly now some 3 years old, and therefore predating the recession, shows you a very interesting set of comparisons between English cities, only the bigger cities, and their mainland European counterparts. What you need to bear in mind here is that the lighter purple background are the national averages for each of those cities, which is why they run in sort of parallel lines through representing the countries. Whereas the bars in heavier, darker purple are the individual cities. And this shows that British cities are punching below their weight in the knowledge-intensive sectors, whereas German cities, on the left, for instance, are punching above their weight. Cities in general across Europe, I'm going to skip this because it's so hopeless. I put it in, and it's really too small, so let's shift to a more manageable one. This one shows the percentage with at least what is called third level education. And it shows once again that the workforces in our core cities, even our core cities like Manchester and Leeds, are much less highly qualified than the national average, which is alarming. And also this is a contrast generally to what is happening in countries like France, Germany, and the Netherlands. This it comes out again and again in this international analysis. This is a percentage working in high technology manufacturing sectors, and at least here West Midlands and Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire come out above the average, but most are still below. And it comes out also in high technology service sectors. The pattern is quite remarkable in chart after chart from the State of the English Cities. Basically, our urban places, even those in quite favoured parts of the country, such as southern England, are actually underperforming. And when we add to this the analysis from the Leach report in 2005, which many of you will be familiar with, we find that the UK as a whole is not performing very well in terms of the scale mix. It's actually in the middle of a great variety of European countries and some other advanced countries. Not the best, but not the worst. But when you consider that this is the average against which those State of the Cities charts were measured, you will see the scale of the problem. This skills gap appears all the way through. And it shows that our workforce is generally underqualified compared with many others. This just is an explanation from the Leach report of how these figures are calculated. This is perhaps one of the most alarming, showing the lack of qualifications, particularly in numeracy, with some 21% in the lowest grade. And further importantly, the Leach report shows that there is a regional dimension to this, as we've already seen. That the below level 2, the grey bars, are very heavily concentrated in the northern and Midland regions, and it's only in and even in London, and also in Northern Ireland and Wales. So it is a picture which is disturbing, and it's underlined, I think, by the increasing debate between the parties on the performance of the educational system. The skills deficit here from a study by the Work Foundation is shown as here in terms of change. And the proportion, the decline in low-skilled is most concentrated in places like Oxford, and also, it must be said, Sheffield and Liverpool, but with much less progress in a number of cities which are quite widely spread across the board, both north and south. Likewise, back to the Centre for Cities again, residents with no qualifications, the lowest proportions are overwhelmingly found in those favoured southern places within striking distance of London, and the highest percentage of those with no qualifications in general are found in the north in a variety of places, many of them the one industry towns like Rochdale and Blackburn, but also including some core cities such as Birmingham and Liverpool. So it's, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So I won't labour this point, but this is almost the end of the Centre for Cities comparisons. The quality of the built environment is also, it turns out, much lower in the northern cities, despite the huge wave of rebuilding that has occurred in recent years. The one area in which it appears that the northern cities do score is affordable housing. But as we've known for the past decade, from evidence going back to the CLG, or ODPM as it was then, Sustainable Cities Report of 2003, the affordability of housing in the north, especially in these old one industry towns like Burnley, is actually a symptom of economic failure because it results from an extremely weak demand, so many people having moved out into the surrounding countryside and leaving a massive discrepancy and a growing discrepancy between the towns themselves and the immediately surrounding rural areas, which is now such a striking feature of a region like the northwest of England. At any rate, summing all this up in terms of an economic prosperity index, which the Centre for Cities finally does, it's very clear where the division lies if you go to the top places in the south and the bottom places on the bottom right, which are so heavily concentrated among these one industry places in the north. So we still have, therefore, and in terms of social deprivation, the same dreary repetition of the same indices. And to sum this up, if you look at the map of the most deprived places on the new CLG Index of Multiple Deprivation 2007, it's striking, of course, that the places with the red dots are in the north and the places with the low deprivation are in the south. However, I'm going to argue in a few minutes that it's a little more complex than that. Just to put that map in chart form, again, the least deprived places in the south and the most deprived in the north. And it's interesting now that although often the big cities, the core cities, have been the most deprived, it now turns out that it's the smaller places, with the exception of Birmingham and Liverpool, which are the most deprived, suggesting that perhaps there is a division appearing here, that the core cities are really beginning to turn around, making a transition to the new jobs, the better paying jobs in the knowledge sectors, and the smaller places are not. This shows the actual record from the 2007 CLG indices, actually from a different source, the deprivation barometer, but it basically shows the same story, as you'll see from the very heavy dark shading across the industrial belt of the northwest and Yorkshire on the right-hand map. However, the changes in the score over 2004-2007 are a little more complicated and interestingly dominated by rural areas such as east of England, the Welsh Marches, and Devon and Cornwall, as rather surprisingly some parts of southeast England. And I haven't really myself worked that one out yet by any means. However, if we concentrate here on the northwest, and this is some research that I did about a year ago when the figures came out, one thing that's remarkable is that places immediately around Manchester, basically the boroughs of Greater Manchester, have improved their position between 2004 and 2007. Sometimes quite spectacularly. If, on the other hand, you go a little north into what I've called central Lancashire, and this is a recognised designation, as many of you will know from the Northern Way strategy, that is the strip of places that starts in Blackpool in the west, through Preston, Blackburn, Accrington, known here as Hyndburn, its official designation, Burnley, and then Pendle, Nelson, which means Nelson and Colne, of course. You find that in each one of these places there has been a significant deterioration. And I think this is significant, although some of the figures you've seen on the charts earlier might appear to contradict this result. I think there's rather clear evidence of a distinction appearing in the northwest between the area around Manchester and the more purely industrial belt to the north, which has simply failed to make the transition as rapidly. However, there is another point now in the Centre for Cities report, which I want to take up and examine in a little more detail, and that is that these averages, of course, for entire local authority areas really may disguise quite large disparities between one small neighbourhood and another. And for that you have to bore down to those smaller units. And this the Centre for Cities has done, and has found that many of the places in the south, which are overall the most prosperous, also have the lowest level of inequality, whereas conversely the places in the north, which have the highest overall levels of deprivation, are also the most unequal, with Blackpool, followed by Manchester, apparently a statistical glitch there, round at the bottom of the table. And this is the same result mapped from the Centre for Cities report, showing the overwhelming preponderance of these very highly unequal places in the north of England, and also, I should say, London. If you seek to look at this in more detail, this is a report from a different source, the AGM APNR unit, which some of you may know. This shows the small area index for 2004. This shows the corresponding index for 2007, still very heavily concentrated in and around central Manchester, but also in the centres of some of the surrounding towns. And this rather interestingly shows you the changes between the two. Now it appears that the places that are getting worse are not in Manchester itself, but in the surrounding places, very heavily in Stockport, it should be said, also in parts of Oldham and Rochdale, and to some degree also in Bolton. Although perhaps a little less in Wigan. I don't pretend to understand this map, and many of you will be much more able than I to begin to interpret it. But it does suggest to me that the core city, Manchester, is not at all doing badly in terms of reducing deprivation, and the deprivation, on the contrast, is getting rather worse in quite considerable areas of the surrounding towns, despite the generally encouraging picture that we've got from the overall borough or district figures. As an illustration of what I mean here, and some of you, with apologies to those who do, will understand particularly what I'm talking about. These indices are derived from what are called the low-level super output areas, which are the very smallest unit that our census now recognizes, and which have the merit of being now locked in. They cannot change from census to census, or also from any kind of statistical count to any other. So you have absolutely uniform units whose boundaries do not change. If you ask what are the most deprived neighbourhoods in all of England in 2007, there are 4 at the very top, and they're quite interesting. One in Liverpool, the very top, a second here in Manchester, a third in Tendring, and I had to look as a geographer where Tendring is. It's on the Essex coast, yes, and a fourth in Blackpool. And here they are. Liverpool Speke, an area in the middle of Speke, just next to the John Lennon Airport, an area here in Harper Hay in East Manchester, and lo and behold, the Tendring one proves to be Jaywick Sands. Those of you with a sociological interest, Michael, will know that this is famous in the literature, being celebrated in a book by Colin Ward and Dennis Hardy, Arcadia for All. It was where people from the East End of London went out in the 1920s and 1930s and built their own homes with their own hands, old sheds, sometimes old tram cars or old buses of great variety of bizarre structures, which have gradually been improved over the decades, but still Jaywick Sands remains an extraordinarily poor area. And finally, Blackpool, what is this? Well, it's the estate on the edge of Blackpool, Mearside Estate, which was built in the 1960s and 1970s on the very edge of Blackpool. Pleasant housing, good quality housing, built to good public housing standards, but very deeply deprived. And there is now, of course, a total disconnect between the physical quality of these areas and what is happening within them. Here is Speke blown up. Here it is on an aerial photograph with the airport at the bottom. And here are some pictures I took last year when I happened to be in Liverpool. The boarded up shots give you an indication, but as you tour the streets, it just looks like any other kind of place. The housing is okay. There are very few cars on the street, which are an indication of the relative poverty. But what we are having here is poverty very often at the edges of our cities, and the same could be true of many of the super output areas here in Wythenshawe, for instance, as many of you will know, where in effect there are enclaves of deep deprivation next to a lot of dynamism, a lot of growth in this and around the centre. So to try to sum up this part of the argument, I think there are three kinds of inequality. First of all, there is a north-south divide, which is so long-standing, so deep, that it hardly bears talking about, that it has appeared again and again and again in those charts you've seen. I like to sum it up as a contrast between what we've called in a research study the southeast megacity region versus what the geographer Danny Dorling at Sheffield University calls an archipelago economy in the north, that is islands of growth separated by deep seas of deprivation. And by the way, the term is derived from a French urbanist, Pierre Veltz, who wrote a book on the subject at the end of the 90s. Now, that archipelago economy is summed up very much by the contrast, the second contrast between the core cities and the old industrial towns, which has begun to appear deeper and deeper, I believe, since the 1980s. And then, as you've just seen from the slides on the screen a moment ago, there is also an emerging within-city divide. This may have continued since time began. I'm always reminded, and this would appeal to the Vice-Chancellor, the classic book by Robert Roberts, The Classic Slum, which describes Salford in 1900. Had these sharp contrasts that appeared between respectable working class areas and what were regarded as rough areas. That's a good old Mancunian or Salford word, rough, which probably still has resonance in many parts of Salford. And I'd argue, but I'd have to argue on the basis of the very limited evidence that I've shown you, that the recession can only worsen some of these contrasts. The first because the evidence so far is that the crisis in financial services has not hit London that badly in comparison with other parts of the country. Secondly, because the old industrial towns have lesser hope of attracting the newer industries, particularly if public investment is reduced. And thirdly, because the within-city divide is as stubborn as ever, particularly if unemployment rises generally, then those who are most likely to be laid off are those with the least qualifications, the least skills, who are qualified in these areas. So the north-south divide is a continuing theme since 1936, the time of the Jarrow March, and the growth of the new industries in and around London, which was so remarked on by observers at the time. And here is the Danny Dorling map, which has been very frequently republished and was the subject of a television program, which some of you, I'm sure, was seen a couple of weeks ago when Danny Dorling was interviewed at length on the question. And it's now a diagonal north-south divide from the Bristol Channel to the Humber Estuary. But it does really rather neatly, I think, encapsulate many of those contrasts that you have seen in the Centre for Cities tables over the last 20 minutes or so. And other evidence which you could adduce from other fairly recent work, like the Regional Futures Study from Arup 4 years ago, which was at strict course regional level, showed that there were persistent differences in gross value added per employed person between North and South, and that this was very much associated, the bottom graph, with the percentage in private sector service jobs, which of course are disproportionately in the so-called knowledge economy. The North, in contrast, has remained very highly dependent on public service employment. Nothing wrong with public service employment. After all, most of us in this room, I suspect, are public service employees, given that universities are such. These can be good jobs, which can hopefully spin off other jobs in the private sector. So one can argue that pumping in more public service jobs could actually be the right way to regenerate places that have failed to make the big transition. But at any rate, these different maps, which are from other sources, including the Arup report and also from the State of the English Cities, dramatically illustrate these north-south differences. It's an extraordinarily persistent pattern. Here are new firm foundations as measured by VAT registration rates. Numerous studies have been made here, and they all tell the same story. Very telling here from the State of the English Cities, gross value added per capita index versus the percentage of low-income households. All the southern places at the top, but Manchester appearing respectably up there with Bristol, and the one industry places in the north down at the bottom. So it's the same story all over again, but with the core cities rather special, pulling ahead of the general regional effect, and the old industrial towns and also seaside resorts down very much at the bottom of the heap. Interestingly, Hastings in southern England always occurs near the bottom of these indices because, rather like Blackpool and the others, it is an old seaside resort that's lost its function. I always tried to show this. I think Michael Parkinson knows that this map this chart tried to bring just too much data onto one chart, but it actually does show, if you can peer at it, that the places at the top are again southern places. So the places that are okay are doing better, at least over that period, that early period, 95-02. This is the period of the boom years. And the places at the bottom of the heap are actually tending to do worse. That is, the discrepancy is growing between them. And that shows it in rather more visible form with the big growth around London and the much more modest growth, or even in some cases decline in the north. It's not a good story. What many of the Centre for Cities charts show is that this region, which we christened, a group of us, the South East England megacity region, this is basically 51 places within around 100 miles of London, including London itself plus 50 others, mainly small and medium sized, are the places that figure disproportionately at the top of all those charts. It's as if the growth of London, the dynamism of London, has rippled out progressively farther and farther out, irradiating into these 50 other places. They are intensively networked in terms of commuting flows and still more information flows, although interestingly they are quite self-contained. The orange parts of these pie graphs show the people who both live and work in the same area. And you can argue, therefore, that places towards the edge of the South East England megacity region are scoring rather high on sustainability. The people don't have to go far to work and there are good jobs there. And this suggests a rather radical conclusion, the one that was suggested a year ago by the right-wing think tank, the Policy Exchange, which caused a big stir last August by suggesting that regional policy was absolutely useless, that we'd been wasting our money over the last 10 years. It happened to be the 10 years of new Labour government, just a coincidence they chose that period, of course, and that we ought to stop regional policy altogether and encourage everyone to get on their bikes or get cheap rail tickets and migrate to the south of England and let places like Oxford and Cambridge rip, which possibly would not have been very popular in either south or north politically. At any rate, the report was promptly disowned by every single politician of every hue. Now, one question here, which I think is relevant for policy, is the role of our core cities. Some of you will know, in fact many of you looking around the room will know, the work of Peter Taylor and his group at the University of Loughborough, the so-called GORC group, Globalisation and World Cities group. They have tried to generate statistically a new urban hierarchy based not on size of population or employment, but on the role in the global structure of command and control in the advanced knowledge-based service industries. The index is a very complex one. It would take me about half an hour to explain how it's generated, and I'm not sure I'd even then succeed. But if you can suspend disbelief and accept that this is some kind of index of status in the modern world, then among English cities, or among UK cities, only London scores in the top 25 or so. Although a number of major European cities, some of them capital cities, some of them commercial capitals such as Frankfurt and Milan, do score relatively highly, just below the favoured top 4 world cities, which are always the ones that are quoted. But if we go on down the GORC hierarchy, a puzzle appears because many blue places in Europe, and including medium-sized cities like Barcelona, Budapest, but no other English cities. And it's only when you get almost to the very bottom of the 100 global cities in the GORC hierarchy that Birmingham and Manchester appear. If you compare that, if you've been looking at what happens among German cities, you'll find that most of the German cities, the major German cities, have already appeared higher up in the chart. And this, I think, just illustrates something which many of us know intuitive, that Germany has a far more distributed, a far more equal pattern of successful economic base among many of its cities. And indeed, one of the paradoxes of the German economy is that even despite the return of the capital function to Berlin, that city has not done half as well as the mayor or the citizens expected it would, because the real strength of the German economy has remained in places like Hamburg or Frankfurt or Munich. Whereas to a disproportionate degree, the power of the UK economy is based on London and what you can call London's penumbra or fringe, this vast global city region. Now, there is some good news from this in the latest evidence from Loughborough, which was published recently, and that suggests that although London holds its unique place at the top of the urban hierarchy, our core cities, including refreshingly Manchester and Birmingham, are going up the chart. And indeed, many English cities, including both the top core cities and some others, like Nottingham, for instance, or Southampton, but that's part of the megacity region, are actually climbing up the charts. Indeed, European cities generally, in their analysis, have been doing better, whereas American cities globally have been somewhat declining. So there is perhaps progress here. And some other work which I did on the basis of some number crunching a couple of years ago, bringing together various indices, some from the State of the English Cities report, some from other pieces of evidence, suggest that the core cities generally continue to have very high need indices. As a whole, many of them are still very deprived places, and that includes Liverpool and Manchester overall, but that they are showing distinct signs of climbing up and out. They are reducing deprivation overall. Whereas the non-core cities in the second group, which include some of those I've mentioned as being part of central Lancashire, are actually doing conspicuously less well. They are marginally less deprived than are some of the core cities, but their capacity to climb out is demonstrably much lower, and this is measuring their performance during the boom years of the late 90s and early, whatever we call this decade, the noughties. So what do we conclude from all this evidence? Some of it is said based on the boom years, some of it based on more recent evidence when the economy was downturning. First of all, I'd argue that it is necessary to continue to build the economies of the core cities, like Manchester, Salford. And two ways to do that will be to reduce perceived distances and to centralize key services, and to build endogenous growth around higher education. And I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do believe it still represents a key strategy. Second, it's to spread the growth around the core cities, again by reducing perceived distances. Second, and this gets very difficult, to identify historic strengths in those economies, difficult as it may be in many cases, especially in the lost manufacturing economy. And thirdly, by developing what I'll call a crazy idea for everywhere, or recalling the spirit of Manchester. For those, I'm sure everyone does know what Manchester was, but I'll explain at the very end in a few minutes. Let me go through some of these points very quickly, and I'm aiming now simply to stimulate some discussion in a few minutes. First of all, we do know that by improving intercity transport services, you can dramatically shrink perceived distance. And an interesting case, I think, is the case of France, a much bigger country geographically than us, in a sense only that the major population centres are on average farther from each other than they are in this country, Scotland apart. And that explains partly why the French had to build a completely new TGV system, whereas we simply speeded up services on the existing lines. But if you look at what happens down in the south of France, and I've been personally travelling down there for leisure recently, the trains go off the fast line onto the old line and meander down, stopping at every station until they get to the Spanish border. But the result of this, interestingly, is that they too share in some of the reduction of speed. These are isochrones. And indeed, the whole philosophy of the French TGV system for the past 30 years has been based on the fact that by speeding up the journey for the first few hundred kilometers out from Paris, you get a big benefit at the periphery of France. And I think the same logic will apply to the current debate we have here about High Speed 2 and High Speed 3, and the government now seems to have taken that on board since Lord Adonis took over responsibility for rail. And therefore, if we built High Speed 2 between London and Manchester, we could actually let it ripple out into the surrounding region, and that could be a thoroughly good thing. Up to now, the main effect of the high-speed train revolution in Europe has actually to bring together the major cities of the core of northwest Europe on the right-hand map: London, Brussels, Paris, Amsterdam, Cologne, and Frankfurt. In effect, it's given greater strength to the places that probably needed it less. And one result and one danger is what two German researchers Klaus Spiekermann and Michael Wegener have called the peripheralization of the periphery. If you shrink the central relationships, then the periphery seems ever farther away. But the improvements that are going to be made to the system in mainland Europe over the coming years are going to have the effect of reducing the peripheralization of the periphery. And if we build high speed, we can do hopefully the same thing. However, it is necessary, vitally necessary, to consider the detail. The devil is always in the detail. Here's what happens, and I took this straight out of the National Rail timetable, if you're travelling as I did this morning up here. Quite impressive. 2 hours 7 minutes, 2 hours 8 minutes between London and Manchester Piccadilly. Go on to Oldham, and that's what happens. It takes you 1 extra hour, basically, to travel 6 miles, 10 kilometres on the National Railway system from Manchester Piccadilly to Oldham Mumps. There's something wrong here, and it can be remedied 2 ways. You can either remedy it by good linkages or to urban transport systems such as the Manchester Metrolink, or better still, you can extend the TGVs. Here is some other work for the Centre for Cities, and it shows the remarkable lack of connections in the rail system of northwest England. And this has been, this is further work that's been done over in the University of Manchester. And Brian in the audience knows all about this. And it shows this fragmented nature of the connections. Now, the Centre for Cities has shown, and I wish I had a few more minutes to illustrate this, that in fact, the places like Burnley are amazingly disconnected from the Manchester economy. Hardly anyone commutes from Burnley to Manchester. It's almost impossible. Whereas people coming an equivalent distance in southern England find it only too easy to travel an equivalent distance from places like Brighton or Reading. That is now illustrated by an extraordinary difference in the economic performance. Now, this, you say, could be a false correlation, but it's still striking that the Reading performance, the Milton Keynes performance, the Oxford performance is close to that of London. Whereas in the lower chart, the performance of Burnley and Blackburn is way below that of Manchester, or significantly Warrington, which is the one place in the northwest outside the core cities that has been doing brilliantly, although perhaps a bit less brilliantly very recently. And that is worth thinking about, because Warrington is now, of course, the first stop out of London on the Virgin Pendolinos on their way to Glasgow. It's brilliantly connected. So what do we do about this? Well, we can build the Metrolink, 2A and 2B. 2A going ahead and 2B somewhat compromised by the pull on the congestion charge, which would actually connect places from the Piccadilly Station Undercroft like Oldham, Rochdale or Ashton-under-Lyne. And that could only do some good. But there's probably more than that needed, because the Metrolink will never get to Burnley. Over in Wales, as some of you will know, they've had a remarkable success in the last year, reopening the long-closed Ebbw Vale line out of Cardiff. And the results on that line have been sensational, far ahead of projection, so that they're putting in further investments. This is a heavy rail line that goes deep up the valleys into those old coal mining areas. And the parallel for me between Ebbw Vale and Burnley is very, very real. The same kind of place, the same kind of territory. But the Welsh are getting the connections up from the Great Western High Speed Cardiff into the valleys in a way that the Northwest is not. The Northwest suffers, as everyone in this room knows, from a severe lack of good electrified lines. This is a point made again and again and again by you all up here, and the need to develop a new network based on the so-called Manchester hub. and all the work you've done on that can only be applauded. But it may take time. And if you take, and here's a bit you could say of special pleading, but it does represent a particular interest that I've developed very recently. If you take the case of Blackpool, which is doing spectacularly badly on many of the indices, it is connected not badly by 8 trains an hour out of the North Station and by 1 train an hour on a single track line out of the South Station. Parallel to that is the historic Blackpool Tramway, which is now receiving 100 million for upgrade. That 90 has now become 100 million, and the upgrade just beginning. But the real possibility here is to transform this totally outmoded South Fylde line by using technology developed in Germany, and here is the city of Kassel in Germany. On the left-hand side is a blue city tram. Imagine that to be one of the new Blackpool trams that will be coming in within a couple of years along the promenade. And on the right is a very strange vehicle indeed, although it doesn't look it. It's an Alstom Regio Citadis hybrid vehicle, and that tram suddenly turns into a suburban diesel railway train and just plunges off into open countryside to arrive half an hour later in a small village outside Kassel here. And what we want to do in Blackpool is to demonstrate that this technology could connect the promenade tramway to Preston and thus to the Pendolino service through to London, providing a brilliant set of connections to the south and also to the rest of the region. And that's we have managed to get around 4 million euros out of the European Union Interreg 3B programme to begin that work almost immediately within the next month. So I'm coming to the end now, but the second point I'd like to make is that we do need very seriously, in addition and parallel to a transport investment, to think about how we could bring to some of these towns a new tradition of engineering in areas that are taking off very spectacularly in other parts of the world. In particular, one of the most impressive things that's happened recently is how Germany has taken a lead in, through very intelligent government policy, in switching to renewable energy, with huge increases in particularly in wind power, and to some extent solar. And anyone flying into a German city now will see all the windmills all around the cities. This is a solar panel installation. And this is creating huge numbers of new firms and huge numbers of new jobs in Germany. And it's providing a staple for investment in new industrial parks, such as this one on the right around the University of Dortmund, and a second technology park now following in Dortmund on this derelict iron and steel works location in the east of the city. Everywhere they are using sites like these to provide the homes for cutting-edge technologies that can meet climate change challenge. And we are, alas, limping behind. Given the very strong industrial traditions of many of our northern towns, I think that this is something that should be taken very seriously. But it, of course, won't do for everywhere. So I think we also need to think of imaginative solutions. The creative city solution has been perhaps almost become a cliche. But if you look at what's happened in a city like Leipzig, a great industrial city in East Germany, comparable in many ways with Manchester, we made a study some 5 years ago making that comparison, a group of us, we find that in that city, the biggest single textile mill in Europe, which went derelict, an extraordinary piece of industrial dereliction after the reunification and collapse of the East German economy. This has been converted to make a hugely attractive arts centre, which has become a basis for a new kind of urban tourism. It's attracting huge numbers of visitors to that city. Now, you're doing lots of this kind of thing in Manchester, but not, I believe, on the Leipzig scale. I come back finally, and this is my last slide, to how you would apply that approach to the problem of the really problematic places. I mentioned that Burnley, it has the most depressed single housing market in England. Year after year, its house prices are the lowest. Huge parts of the city and adjacent Nelson and Colne have been boarded up and are being demolished. This is an area of Burnley that's already gone, with more due to go, and a generally very depressed economic outlook. The late Anthony Wilson, who was famous in this city for having launched Factory Records in the 70s and the Hacienda nightclub, and his partner Yvette Livesey were asked into Burnley by Elevate East Lancashire to look at the prospects of that town. And together they produced an amazing strategy which would be only possible, I think, for someone who'd almost had the appellation Manchester applied to himself personally. Sadly, as I'm sure everyone will know, Tony Wilson died about 18 months ago, and we lost his talents. But hopefully his legacy will continue, because the legacy was, as in Leipzig, to take a huge industrial complex in the centre of the town, the Weavers' Triangle, and in effect convert it to attract a range of activities, some of them really quite bizarre, which would in effect create a new economy around culture and associated tourism, which would not only bring people into the town, but would make it attractive to new residents. This obviously would go with increasing the accessibility, at present almost non-existent, to connect it with the rest of northwest England. And I think the approach they argued for here is one that could be used very generally. However, the problem about it is that each town, each city would have to devise its own USP, unique sales proposition. And that's going to be very hard. This proposition could work for Burnley, but what for all the other places? And we only had one, Tony Wilson, and we've lost him, although mercifully his partner still survives him, and perhaps she can produce some other equally brilliant but different ideas. But I am convinced that it's only by a combination of better accessibility, which means infrastructure expenditure, better support through higher education and further education, and a combination of really rather brilliant, completely out of the way ideas, that we will regenerate the many places like Burnley. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't continued too long. Thank you.